So, in this video, we'll talk about companies and recruiting. Have you ever heard of butts in seats? Or how about this one? Every seat, there's a butt for every seat. you know, if you pay attention to small trucking companies, little mom and pops, one of their biggest complaints is that they can't get good quality drivers. And why is that? I mean, everyone talks about driver shortage, but it's kind of, a myth to say there's a driver shortage. What there's a shortage of is companies willing to pay for good quality drivers. See, these mom and pops often go out of business because they say they can't find good quality drivers. Well, where are all the good quality drivers? Well, they're with the big box carriers, or they're independent contractors, or they're somewhere else, but they're not with necessarily the mom and pops. You know, the big box carriers often offer a lot more to a driver than the mom and pop companies can. So naturally, drivers with good safety records migrate towards the big box carriers. You think about the benefit packages, the retirement plans, the profit sharing, the pay per mile. All this combined makes the big box carrier much more attractive than a mom and pop. They just can't compete. Mom and pops can't compete because they don't have the economies of scale, which means they're not big enough to pass on savings to the drivers. They like to take for health insurance. The more people that are in the health insurance plan lowers the cost. Well, if you're a big box carrier, you got 10,000 employees, you can keep healthcare costs low. But if you're a mom and pop and you got 100 employees, your healthcare costs are going to be a little higher. Same thing with profit sharing. It may not be a lot of profit with a mom and pop, and they may not even offer profit sharing. So why would a good quality driver drive for a small trucking company? It's one of these things where bigger is better. Size does matter. Um, so the small companies end up looking for drivers, or end up having the drivers that aren't good enough to make it with a big box carrier. Maybe they have safety, you know, issues with their license. Maybe they're a vulnerable, percent of the driving population. Like we see, new immigrants, for example. Um, Maybe they have drug and alcohol problems. Something that would prevent them from being hired by a big box carrier. Otherwise, they would be working for a big box carrier. So they don't get the best drivers. Maybe these drivers aren't necessarily the best workers either. So there may be high turnover, and so these mom and pop operations often complain that they can't get good drivers. I think there's nothing fundamentally um, overwhelming in trucking. A lot of it's basic math. When you look at profit and loss, it's addition and subtraction. It's revenue minus costs. It's not overly complicated. In similar way, you can imagine yourself as a business owner. Say, okay, I want to have 10 trucks and I want to hire drivers. You can do that if you have the capital, the money, the resources to go buy 10 trucks. You could do that. There's nothing, that requires a enormous amount of education or expertise or talent, for you to go out and start your own fleet of 10 trucks. Hard work? Absolutely. Having money, or seed money to startup costs? Absolutely. You got to have that. But nothing, that says you couldn't do it. One of the things you're going to find is that you're going to struggle getting good quality drivers. And that's true for every mom and pop operation out there. And even if they hired a good driver, the driver may not stay long because they have better opportunities elsewhere. So you see a lot of these companies will hire students, or the new CDL uh, licensed student. And they'll start them out at a very low wage with high turnover in this company, very high turnover. So they don't get the cream of the crop. The cream always rises to the top, so the best drivers always are moving up, 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 and up. So the drivers who have issues with their CDL or safety issues, or they don't have any experience, they start at some of these smaller companies. But I don't think it's impossible for you to have your own trucking company. Obviously there are tens of thousands of members of the National Association of Small Trucking Companies, NASTY. And you can have a lot of trucks, but can you recruit the drivers? That's the name of the game. Recruiting is the name of the game. And if you notice, like here at Crete, the big box carriers, they give incentives to drivers to recruit other drivers. There's a recruiting bonus associated with that. So they're always bringing in new drivers. Always bringing in good quality drivers to haul their freight. And as as a result, you look at some of the larger contracts, with Fortune 500 companies like Walmart. They look at those big box carriers and say, you got some of the best drivers in the industry. We want to have this, freight contract with you year over year over year, long-term customers. So the business model works really, really good if you're a big box carrier and you're like part of the ATA, American Truck Association. You're one of the big boys. You're one of the big players. You got lots of drivers, good quality drivers to haul that freight. You're getting good contracts with Fortune 500 companies and so on and so on. But everything depends on the ability to attract, retain, hire, retract, and retrain good quality drivers. So this is where the smaller companies struggle, because it's competition for drivers. So then they say, well, there's a driver shortage. Not really. There's not really a driver shortage. If you look at how many people quit the industry year over year over year, the turnover, the churn rate, it's because it's a tough job, and people try it and they don't like it and they leave. They find other opportunities outside of trucking. Lots of people get their CDL, but they don't necessarily remain in the industry. And you're like, well, why is that? It's like, largely it's because demands of the job far exceed the pay. You have to work really, really hard for not so great a pay. And you're like, well, if I'm going to work that hard, I can work somewhere else and get paid. So there's not a shortage of people getting their CDL. It's not like the CDL is too large of a barrier for people to enter into the trucking industry. It is a barrier for sure, but with so many companies offering free training, free CDL training, that barrier can easily be overcome. So that this is again an aspect of butts in seat. Why do companies offer free CDL training? Well, they want to develop their own good quality drivers. They want to, they're going to plant the seeds and harvest the crop, of new students, and then this will be, homegrown talent rather than relying on hiring from other companies. They just, bring them in, train them right the first time, put them with a trainer for 6 months, turn them into a good quality driver, and so they'll have homegrown talent. But it's enormous cost. And you look at why do companies bend over backwards to get drivers and trucks? Well, it's because recruiting is the name of the game. You could go purchase equipment. You can go purchase trailers. You can go purchase tractors. Okay, those are fairly transactional processes. You can pick loads off the load board. You can, have customers with freight to haul, but can you get the good quality driver? That's the hard part. That's the real hard part, is attracting those drivers. So, it comes down to whether these small trucking companies make it or not. Depends on how good are their drivers. This is the competitive edge that some companies have, Because all else being the same, if you're driving a Freightliner at Crete and you're driving a Freightliner at Warner and you're driving a Freightliner at Schneider, what's the difference? Well, it may come down to the quality of drivers you have. So that would be a competitive advantage one company might have over the other. It's their ability to attract, retain good quality drivers. That's attractive to the customers, the Fortune 500 customers that give the best contracts. So, this is the major aspect of the entire industry when it comes to trucking is, you know, can you keep your drivers? Can you hire the drivers that are going to make you successful? And can you keep your drivers? Generally speaking, the smaller companies can't keep their drivers. And that's a lot of reason why they struggle. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.